In 1991, a superpower disappeared, not invaded, not bombed, not defeated in battle, collapsed. The Soviet Union, a nuclear empire with thousands of warheads, millions of soldiers, and control over half of Europe, simply broke apart. No American army marched into Moscow. No nuclear missile ended it. No surrender was signed. The flag came down. And the Cold War was over. For 45 years, the world believed this conflict would end in fire. Two nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. Children practiced nuclear drills. Governments built bunkers. Generals planned for Armageddon. Everyone expected World War III. It never came. And yet someone won, because history does not record the Cold War as a draw. When it ended, only one superpower remained standing. So here is the real question. How do you defeat a nuclear empire without fighting it directly? The answer is uncomfortable. The Cold War was not a shooting war between Washington and Moscow. It was a contest of systems. Capitalism versus communism. Markets versus central planning. Flexibility versus rigidity. And America understood something early. If you cannot destroy your enemy without destroying yourself, make them compete. Compete in weapons. Compete in technology. Compete in influence. Compete in spending. And never stop. From the late 1940s onward, both sides entered an arms race. Missiles multiplied. Submarines expanded. Bombers improved. Each side built more than the other, but only one of them had an economy capable of sustaining endless competition. The Soviet Union was powerful, but it was structurally fragile. Its economy was centrally planned. Production targets were political decisions. Innovation moved slowly. Consumer goods were secondary to military output. Meanwhile, the United States operated a dynamic market system fueled by private enterprise, competition, and global trade. This difference mattered because the Cold War was not decided in a single battle. It was decided year by year, budget by budget. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending an enormous portion of its GDP on defense, far higher proportionally than the United States. To maintain parity, it had to sacrifice consumer prosperity. Shops grew emptier, infrastructure lagged, technological gaps widened, and still.
If you want history without the sugarcoating, if you want to understand how power really works, then subscribe to Forgotten Empires, because the biggest battles in history were never fought on battlefields.
The Soviet Union did not collapse in a single moment. It was squeezed, slowly, deliberately, year after year. The Cold War turned into a financial endurance test, and the United States understood that economics, not missiles, would decide the outcome. At first glance, both superpowers looked evenly matched. The Soviet Union had a massive army. It had nuclear parity. It had global influence stretching across Eastern Europe, parts of Asia, and beyond. But power is not just about weapons. It is about the system that sustains them. The American economy in the post-World War II era expanded rapidly. Industrial output surged. Technological innovation accelerated. Private companies competed aggressively. Capital flowed freely. The Soviet model was different. Central planning dictated production targets. Factories answered to ministries, not markets. Efficiency was secondary to quotas. For a while, this system appeared stable. But stability under pressure is something else entirely. The arms race intensified through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Each new American missile demanded a Soviet response. Each new submarine required a countermeasure. Each new weapons system forced duplication. This wasn't symbolic. It was expensive. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, estimates suggest the Soviet Union was spending an enormous percentage of its national income on defense, significantly higher proportionally than the United States. And here was the imbalance. The American economy was far larger overall. So even if both sides increased spending, the burden weighed heavier on Moscow. To maintain military parity, the Soviet Union sacrificed consumer development. Shops struggled with shortages. Housing quality lagged. Technological modernization slowed. The United States could absorb defense spending while still expanding its consumer economy. The Soviet Union could not. Then came a second blow. Energy prices. Oil exports were one of the Soviet Union's primary sources of hard currency. When global oil prices fell sharply in the mid-1980s, revenue declined dramatically. Foreign currency inflow weakened. The ability to purchase advanced technology from abroad diminished. Pressure intensified. And instead of slowing the race, the United States escalated it. Under President Ronald Reagan, military spending surged again. Advanced weapons programs expanded. Research accelerated. Then came the Strategic Defense Initiative. To American voters, it was a futuristic missile shield proposal. To Soviet leadership, it was something else. It was a signal that the United States was prepared to raise the stakes even further. If America developed a system that could intercept nuclear missiles, the foundation of Soviet deterrence would weaken. Matching such a program would require immense resources, and the Soviet economy was already straining. This is where the Cold War stopped being about ideology and became about arithmetic. How long could each side sustain the competition? America's economy continued growing. The Soviet economy stagnated. Growth slowed. Productivity lagged. Structural inefficiencies became harder to hide. To compete with a dynamic, market-driven superpower required flexibility. The Soviet system was rigid. The longer the race continued, the deeper the imbalance grew. No invasion was necessary. No direct confrontation was required, because every new weapons system announced in Washington forced a decision in Moscow: spend more and increase internal strain, or fall behind and risk strategic vulnerability. Either option carried risk, and year after year, the strain accumulated. The Cold War was not decided by a dramatic explosion. It was decided by endurance. And endurance is measured in budgets, output, and sustainability. By the mid-1980s, the pressure was no longer abstract. It was visible. Economic stagnation, rising dissatisfaction, falling oil revenue, and a leadership forced to attempt reforms under conditions of weakness. The battlefield was never in Berlin or Washington. It was inside spreadsheets, inside production reports, inside national accounts. And the numbers were not in Moscow's favor. Economic pressure weakens a system, but it doesn't destroy it. What destroys a system is doubt. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was not just struggling financially, it was struggling psychologically. For decades, the Communist Party told its citizens a simple story: capitalism was unstable, America was collapsing, communism was the future. And for years, many believed it. The Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany. It had launched the first satellite, Sputnik. It had sent the first human into space. It looked powerful, but power is not just rockets. It's daily life. And daily life in the Soviet Union was not improving at the same pace as the West. While American suburbs expanded, Soviet housing shortages persisted. While Western stores overflowed with consumer goods, Soviet citizens stood in long lines while American companies innovated rapidly. Soviet industries moved slowly under bureaucratic control. This contrast mattered, because even in a controlled state, information leaks. Western television signals crossed borders in parts of Eastern Europe. Foreign visitors saw differences. Travelers compared, and comparisons are dangerous. The Cold War was never only about missiles. It was about which system people believed in, and belief began to shift. Inside the Soviet bloc, dissatisfaction grew quietly. Not rebellion at first, just frustration. Slow growth, low-quality goods, limited freedom. Then came reform. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to leadership. He knew the system was stagnating. He introduced two policies: perestroika, economic restructuring; glasnost, political openness. The intention was survival. The effect was exposure. For the first time in decades, citizens were allowed more open discussion. Criticism surfaced. Hidden inefficiencies became public. Corruption became visible. Nationalist movements gained confidence. What had been suppressed began to rise. This was a dangerous shift, because once people are allowed to question authority, control weakens. Eastern Europe reacted first. In 1989, movements across Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia accelerated. The Berlin Wall fell, not because American tanks smashed through it, but because Soviet leadership chose not to intervene. That decision was symbolic. It signaled hesitation. It signaled restraint. It signaled weakness. For decades, Moscow had enforced control through force. Now it stepped back, and when an empire steps back, others step forward. The psychological barrier cracked inside the Soviet Union itself. Republics began asserting autonomy: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine. The belief that the Union was permanent began to fade. And here is the deeper truth. The United States did not directly create this doubt, but its sustained competition amplified it. When citizens see a rival system prosper while their own stagnates, questions multiply. When economic pressure meets ideological doubt, stability erodes. The Cold War battlefield moved from weapons factories to living rooms, from military bases to public conversations, from external rivalry to internal uncertainty. And once uncertainty spreads through an empire, it becomes far more dangerous than any missile. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was not only economically strained, it was psychologically fractured. Confidence in the system weakened. Confidence in leadership weakened. Confidence in permanence weakened. And when an empire no longer believes in itself, collapse is no longer unthinkable. It becomes possible. Pressure alone does not destroy an empire. Pressure plus miscalculation does. And for the Soviet Union, that miscalculation was Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan expecting a quick intervention. It was meant to stabilize a neighboring communist government. Instead, it became a decade-long war, a slow bleed, a draining commitment of men, money, and credibility. The United States did not invade the Soviet Union. It did something more strategic. It supported the resistance. Through funding, training, and weapons, including advanced anti-aircraft systems, Afghan fighters were supplied to resist Soviet forces. What followed was not a decisive battlefield defeat. It was attrition. Soviet casualties mounted. Equipment was lost. Costs rose, and the war dragged on. For the Soviet public, it became increasingly unpopular. For the economy, it became increasingly expensive. For leadership, it became increasingly embarrassing. The war exposed a dangerous reality. The Soviet military was powerful, but not invincible. Meanwhile, economic strain continued at home. Oil revenues fluctuated. Productivity stagnated. Military spending remained high, and reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev introduced uncertainty instead of stability. Perestroika attempted to modernize the economy, but partial reform created imbalance. Old structures weakened. New systems were not yet effective. Glasnost opened public discourse, but openness revealed frustration. Criticism spread faster than solutions, and while leadership attempted controlled transformation, the system began shifting faster than it could manage. Eastern Europe moved first. In 1989, one communist government after another fell. Poland negotiated political reform. Hungary opened its borders. East Germans flooded into West Germany. The Berlin Wall collapsed. Not through invasion, through momentum. And Moscow did not intervene. That decision mattered. For decades, Soviet authority had rested on the certainty of force. Now restraint replaced intervention. The message traveled quickly. If the Red Army would not enforce control in Berlin, would it enforce it elsewhere? Inside the Soviet Union, republics took notice. National identity movements strengthened. Lithuania declared independence in 1990. Others followed. The Union began fragmenting from within. Then came August 1991. Hardline communist officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev. They feared the Union was dissolving. They feared reform had gone too far. They tried to reassert control. The coup failed, and its failure shattered the remaining illusion of stability. It proved that central authority was no longer secure. Republic leaders accelerated independence declarations. Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for independence, and once Ukraine left, the Union could not function as before. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union. The superpower ceased to exist. No American missile triggered it. No NATO invasion forced it. But decades of economic strain, military overextension, political reform under pressure, and ideological erosion had pushed the system beyond recovery. The Cold War did not end in a single dramatic explosion. It ended in accumulated instability, and that instability reached a breaking point. By the time the final documents were signed, the Soviet Union was not defeated on a battlefield. It was exhausted, internally divided, structurally weakened, strategically outlasted. The war that was never officially fought had reached its conclusion, and the collapse confirmed something profound. The decisive blows were never delivered by direct attack. They were delivered by time, pressure, and imbalance. In December 1991, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was official. 15 republics emerged from the ruins of what had once been a nuclear superpower. The Cold War was over, and the United States stood alone. No rival superpower, no ideological equal, no competing global system with comparable reach. For the first time in modern history, the international system became unipolar. But here is what makes this moment historically unique. America did not conquer the Soviet Union. It did not occupy Moscow. It did not dictate surrender terms after a battlefield victory. The Soviet Union collapsed under accumulated strain. Economic pressure, military overextension, ideological erosion, internal fragmentation, and sustained competition. It could not afford to win. This is what winning meant in the nuclear age. Not destruction, not invasion, outlasting from the late 1940s onward. The strategy was containment, limiting Soviet expansion while strengthening Western alliances. Institutions like NATO surrounded Soviet influence. Economic integration deepened among Western states. Technological innovation accelerated. Financial systems expanded globally. The United States built a networked order. The Soviet Union relied on centralized control. One system thrived under competition. The other struggled under it, and time favored the more flexible structure. By the late 1980s, the imbalance was undeniable. The United States could sustain defense spending without sacrificing domestic growth. The Soviet Union could not. The United States could adapt. The Soviet Union reformed too late. The United States encouraged competition. The Soviet Union depended on control. In the end, there was no dramatic battlefield. There was no decisive military strike. There was simply a point where the strain exceeded the structure's ability to hold. That is how the Cold War was won. Without a direct war between Washington and Moscow, without American troops crossing Soviet borders, without nuclear exchange, it was won through endurance, through sustained pressure, through structural advantage, and through a competition one side could absorb better than the other. But this story is not just about the past. It reveals something deeper about modern power. In the nuclear age, direct war between major powers becomes too dangerous. So, conflict shifts. To economics, to technology, to alliances, to influence, to endurance. The Cold War demonstrated that global dominance in the modern world is not always seized through conquest. It can be secured through stability, adaptability, and the ability to sustain competition longer than your rival. The Soviet Union did not fall in a day. It fell under decades of imbalance, and when it collapsed, the United States did not celebrate a battlefield victory. It inherited a new global order. The war that never officially began reshaped the world more than many wars that did, and its conclusion proved a quiet but powerful lesson. Sometimes the most decisive victories are the ones where no shot is fired.